The fog had not yet lifted from Mayfair when Duke Alistair Ravenscroft stepped out of the House of Lords and into a hired carriage, his mind still heavy from a session that had achieved nothing but tired arguments and tired men. It was early evening, the sky bruised purple over the chimney tops, and he had no wish to go home to an empty house. So he told his driver to stop, instead, at the Crown and Feather, a coaching inn tucked behind Berkeley Square, where the innkeeper knew him by name and never asked questions he did not wish to answer. He took his usual table by the window, ordered a plate of mutton and boiled potatoes he barely tasted, and sat watching the lamplighters move down the street with their long poles, coaxing flame into glass. 6 years he had eaten alone in places like this. 6 years since the house at Ravenscroft had felt like anything but a museum of a life he was meant to have lived. He did not finish the meal. He rarely did. He pushed the plate an inch away, signaling to the innkeeper that he was done, and reached for his hat and gloves. It was outside, beneath the inn's swinging sign, that everything changed. A young woman stood at the edge of the lamplight, thin as a reed, wrapped in a wool cloak gone gray with wear and patched at one shoulder with mismatched cloth. Her boots were cracked. Her hands, when she clasped them in front of her, trembled slightly from the cold, though her voice, when it came, was steady and carried the careful politeness of someone who had learned not to expect kindness, but to ask for it anyway. "Your Grace," she said, with a small curtsy that nearly unbalanced her. "Forgive me. Might I have what you did not finish?" Alistair looked up to refuse her gently, to call the innkeeper and have a proper plate sent out instead of letting her take scraps like a dog at the door, and the words died somewhere in his throat. It was her face. Not similar, not reminiscent. Hers. The same high cheekbones, the same wide gray eyes that had once looked at him across a ballroom and made him forget the name of the woman he was meant to be dancing with. The same small scar above her left eyebrow from a fall off a garden wall, a scar he had once kissed and teased her about for an entire summer. The plate in his hand tilted, and only the innkeeper's quick hand kept it from shattering on the cobblestones. "Isolde," he said, before he could stop himself. The woman blinked at him, confused, perhaps a little frightened by the intensity in his stare. My name is Rose, Your Grace. I do not know any Isolde." He stared at her as though she had struck him. Lady Isolde Fairhaven, his fiancée, the woman he had been 3 weeks from marrying when the royal court accused her of stealing the Emerald of Wessex from the Crown's own vault. The woman who had fled in the night rather than face a trial she swore was built on lies. The woman whose overturned, burned-out carriage had been found at the bottom of a ravine in Surrey 2 days later, with no body inside, though the river nearby had been high and fast enough, the magistrate said, to carry a body for miles. 6 years he had told himself she was dead. 6 years he had worn black beneath his fine coats, a private mourning no one else knew of, because grief for a woman accused of treason was not grief London wished to witness. And now she stood before him, in rags, asking permission to eat his leftovers, and did not know her own name. "Forgive me," he said quickly, forcing his voice into something gentler, something that would not send her running. You resemble someone I once knew very well. Please, sit. I shall have a fresh plate brought for you, something hot, not my cold leavings." Rose hesitated, clearly unused to such offers being sincere. But the cold and hunger won against suspicion, and she nodded and lowered herself onto the bench across from him, careful, as though she expected at any moment to be told it was a cruel jest. Alistair called for the innkeeper, ordered meat pie and warm bread and a mug of spiced cider, his hands not quite steady as he did it. While they waited, he studied her, without meaning to stare, cataloguing every detail that confirmed what his mind refused to fully accept. Around her neck, just visible above the frayed collar of her dress, hung a thin chain, and on it, his breath caught again, a small sapphire ring. The very ring he had placed on Isolde's finger the night he proposed beneath the cedar tree at Ravenscroft Hall. That ring, he said, carefully. "Might I ask where you came by it?" Rose's hand went to her throat, fingers closing protectively around the stone. "I do not know, Your Grace. I have had it as long as I remember, which is not very long at all. I woke beside a road some years past with little memory of who I was before. The ring was around my neck then, same as now. I have never sold it, though God knows I have been hungry enough to." Alistair felt something crack open in his chest, equal parts hope and horror. She was alive. She had been alive this whole time, starving in the streets of his own city, while he wore mourning in silk and attended sessions of Parliament, certain she was lost forever. He wanted to seize her hands across the table and tell her everything. Her name, her family, the wedding that never came, the 6 years stolen from them both. But something held him back, some old instinct sharpened by years of court politics and betrayal. If word spread tonight that the supposedly dead Lady Fairhaven had been found, the very people who had framed her, for he had never believed she was a thief, not for one single day, would know to come looking before he could protect her, or even before he understood what had truly happened to her. "I must fetch your meal myself," he said instead, rising. "The kitchen is slow tonight. Wait here, I beg you." She nodded, trusting in the way only the desperately hungry trust the promise of food, and he hurried inside, his mind racing through a dozen plans at once: where to take her, how to protect her, how to learn what she remembered without frightening her into silence. He was gone perhaps 4 minutes when he returned, plate in hand. The bench was empty. He searched the street in both directions, called for the innkeeper, questioned a boy sweeping the gutter nearby, but it was as though Mayfair's evening fog had simply swallowed her whole. No one had seen which way she went. Alistair stood in the lamplight long after the plate had gone cold in his hands, his carriage waiting, his house waiting, his old life waiting to reclaim him, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that he would not be going home tonight, nor for many nights after, until he found her again. For 2 days Alistair searched without rest, though never through official channels. He dared not send constables, for a magistrate's inquiry into a homeless girl resembling a dead, disgraced lady would reach the wrong ears within hours. Instead, he sent his most trusted servants, his old valet Hodges, who had served the family since Alistair was a boy, and a quiet, capable woman named Mrs. Aldous, who had once nursed his late mother, out into Whitechapel and Clerkenwell with instructions to ask after a thin young woman called Rose, fair-haired, grey-eyed, with a scar above her brow. It was Hodges who found her, on the 2nd evening, at a charitable bakery attached to St. Aldwyn's parish church. She was kneading dough in a back room thick with flour dust and the smell of rising bread. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands moving with the practiced motion of someone who had done this work for years in exchange for nothing grander than bread and a bed in the servants' loft above the kitchen. Alistair went himself the following morning, dressed plainly, his fine coat left at home in favor of one less likely to draw stares. He found the vicar first, an elderly man named Reverend Thorne, and asked after the girl under the pretense of wishing to support the parish's charitable work. "Rose," the vicar said, leading him through to a small garden behind the church. "A good girl, hard-working, devout, despite everything she has suffered. We found her some years back, on the road outside the village of Esher, lying half-drowned in a ditch with her head badly struck. We did not think she would live. When she woke, she remembered her own name and little else. No family came looking, no notices in the papers matched her description, so in time she came to us, and we gave her work and shelter." Alistair's chest tightened at the mention of Esher, not 30 miles from the ravine where Isolde's carriage had been found burned and empty. He thanked the vicar and asked, as casually as he could manage, whether he might speak with the girl directly regarding employment. His elderly aunt, he explained, was in want of a companion, someone gentle and reliable, and he would pay handsomely for the right young woman. Rose was brought out, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, startled to see the gentleman from the inn standing in the churchyard. She did not recognize him as anything more than the stranger who had ordered her a hot meal 2 nights past, and then mysteriously vanished before she could thank him properly. "You left before I could return," he said, offering a small, careful smile. "I confess I have thought of it since. It troubled me, leaving you waiting." "It is no matter, Your Grace. I am not unused to disappointment." She said it without bitterness, simply as fact, and something in the plainness of it struck him harder than any accusation could have. Over the following days he returned often, always with some small excuse: a basket of provisions for the parish, a question about the bakery's needs, an enquiry after her health, and slowly, carefully, a kind of ease grew between them. She was sharp-witted in a way poverty had not dulled, quick to laugh despite her circumstances, curious about the world beyond Whitechapel's narrow streets. He found himself, more than once, forgetting entirely that he had come to study her for proof of who she was, and simply enjoying her company, as he had once enjoyed Isolde's, before the world had taken her from him. She told him, in pieces, what little she remembered of her life before the road outside Isha. Rain, the sound of horses screaming, panicked, broken glass, and the strange, cold sensation of water closing over her face. A man's voice calling a name into the storm, though she could never recall the name itself, nor whether it had been her own. "Sometimes I dream of a garden," she admitted one afternoon, sitting on the low wall outside the bakery while he stood nearby, ostensibly inspecting a delivery of flour sacks. "Roses, climbing over a stone wall, a cedar tree. I do not know why it comes to me, since I have never been to such a place that I recall." Alistair said nothing, though his hands had gone still on the sacks he pretended to count. The rose garden at Ravenscroft Hall, beneath the very cedar where he had once asked her to marry him. He noticed, too, that she still wore the sapphire ring on its chain, tucked always beneath her collar, touching it absently when she was thinking or troubled, as though some part of her understood its importance, even when the rest of her memory offered nothing. "You wear that ring close," he said one evening, nodding to where the chain caught the light. Rose's fingers closed around it instinctively. "I do not know why. It feels wrong, somehow, to be parted from it, as though I made a promise I cannot remember making." Alistair looked at her for a long moment, the bakery's warm lamplight softening the hollows of her tired face, and felt the old grief in his chest twist into something far more complicated: hope and fear, and a tenderness he had thought buried 6 years deep. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the promise is closer than you think." The offer of employment was simple enough to arrange. Alistair's aunt, Lady Euphemia Ravenscroft, was indeed elderly and in want of a companion, having buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her friends, and she agreed readily when her nephew suggested a quiet young woman from a respectable parish in London. What he did not tell her, in his letter, was the truth of who that young woman was. He thought it kinder and safer to let her see for herself. Rose left Whitechapel with a single traveling bag, her few belongings folded inside, and a nervous excitement she tried to hide beneath good manners. The journey north took the better part of 3 days by horse-drawn carriage, through towns and countryside she did not recognize, but which seemed, more than once, to stir some flicker of recognition behind her eyes. A church spire, a bend in a river, the particular grey-green colour of the moors as the carriage climbed further into Northumberland. Ravenscroft Hall rose out of the hills like something built by giants and forgotten by time, its grey stone walls softened by ivy, its windows catching the last gold light of evening. Rose stared up at it from the carriage window, her hand pressed flat against her chest. "I have seen this place," she whispered. "I am certain of it." Lady Euphemia met them at the door, a tall, sharp-eyed woman in dark silk, leaning on a cane she did not strictly need, but used regardless for the authority it lent her. She took one look at Rose's face in the dying light and went perfectly still, her cane's tip catching on the stone step. "Alistair," she said, very quietly, not taking her eyes from the young woman beside him. "A word, if you please." He drew his aunt aside while servants saw to the luggage, and in low, urgent tones explained what he had not dared write in any letter: who he believed Rose to be, what little she remembered, and his fear that revealing the truth too quickly might frighten her into flight, or worse, alert whoever had truly wished Isolde dead. Lady Euphemia's composure cracked only once, a hand pressed briefly to her mouth, before she gathered herself with the iron discipline of a woman who had survived 2 husbands and a great deal of scandal besides. "Then we shall say nothing," she agreed. "But God help me, Alistair. I do not know how I am to look at that girl and call her merely a companion." She managed it better than she expected, though her eyes followed Rose constantly over the following days, soft with a grief and hope she could not entirely disguise. It was the gardens that did the most damage to Rose's careful, fragile peace. On her 3rd afternoon at the Hall, she wandered out among the rose beds while Lady Euphemia napped, and stopped dead at the sight of the old stone wall climbing thick with white roses, and beyond it, the cedar tree standing alone on its small rise of lawn. She did not remember walking toward it. She only knew that standing beneath its branches, she was suddenly laughing. Somewhere, sometime, she had stood in this exact spot and laughed until her sides ached, a man's voice teasing her about something she could no longer recall the words of, only the warmth of it. Her knees nearly buckled. She caught herself against the cedar's broad trunk, breathing hard, as another memory surfaced unbidden. Candlelight, the smooth keys of a pianoforte beneath her fingers, a room full of warm laughter, and the smell of beeswax polish. And then, sharper than the rest, a man kneeling before her beneath this very tree, a small box open in his palm, asking her something her heart already knew the answer to, before her mind could supply the words. She found Alistair an hour later in the library, and though she said nothing of what she had felt, he saw it plainly in her face, pale, shaken, her eyes too bright. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been happy here before. I do not understand how that can be true when I have never set foot in Northumberland in my life, so far as I know." He wanted, desperately, to tell her everything. He held the truth back only by the narrowest margin of will, fearful still of pushing memory too hard before it was ready to return whole. The nightmares began that same week. Rose woke twice in the night, with screams caught in her throat, drenched in sweat, certain she had been fleeing something. Masked riders pursuing a carriage through driving rain, the carriage wheel catching, the terrible lurch as it overturned. Mrs. Aldous, brought north to attend her, sat with her through the worst of these nights, offering what comfort she could, without understanding its source. Word of the mysterious young woman taken into the Duke's household did not stay contained within Ravenscroft's walls for long. Within a fortnight, whispers had reached the neighbouring estates, and from there, inevitably, toward London, that the reclusive Duke Ravenscroft had brought home a companion for his aunt, who bore, by all accounts, a striking and unsettling resemblance to a lady the kingdom had long believed dead. It was Lady Euphemia who finally remembered the journal, some 3 weeks into Rose's stay at the Hall, while the 2 women sat together in the drawing-room of an evening, Rose's needlework forgotten in her lap, as another half-formed memory left her quiet and distant. "There is something I have not spoken of," Lady Euphemia said carefully, watching Alistair where he stood by the fire. "Isolde kept a journal. She wrote in it constantly, the months before she vanished. I remember teasing her for it, telling her no young lady ought to have so many secrets to fill a book with. After she disappeared, her father, in his grief, gave the journal to the family solicitor in York for safekeeping, fearing it might be seized or destroyed if it remained in the house. I had nearly forgotten it myself." Alistair was already calling for the carriage before his aunt had finished the sentence. The journey to York took the better part of a day, Rose silent for most of it, watching the moors give way to gentler farmland through the carriage window, her hand never far from the sapphire ring at her throat. She had grown used to the strange, unexplained pull she felt toward places and objects she could not remember, and had stopped questioning it aloud, though Alistair could see the effort it cost her to remain calm in the face of so much that made no sense. The solicitor, a stooped, careful man named Mr. Pemberton, was reluctant at first to release anything from his locked archive, citing the delicacy of the family's affairs and the years that had passed without instruction. It was only when Alistair revealed, in the privacy of the man's office, his belief regarding Rose's true identity, that Pemberton's resistance crumbled into something closer to alarm. "Your Grace," he said, lowering his voice, though they were quite alone, I must tell you plainly, the journal is not complete. Some years past, a gentleman came with papers claiming legal authority on behalf of the family to remove certain pages for safekeeping elsewhere. I did not think to question it at the time. I have regretted it since. Who was this gentleman? Pemberton frowned, trying to recall. I did not know him personally. A well-dressed man, courteous, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I am ashamed to say I did not press for more than the papers he presented, which appeared entirely in order. He produced the journal regardless, a slim, leather-bound book, its lock long since broken, perhaps a third of its pages missing entirely, torn close to the spine with a neatness that suggested deliberate care rather than accident. Rose took it with trembling hands. She did not recognize the handwriting as her own, not consciously, but something in her responded to it nonetheless, her breath catching as she turned the first surviving pages. The early entries were ordinary enough. Accounts of dinners, observations on neighbors, small complaints about a dressmaker who had ruined a sleeve. But as the dates progressed toward the final months before her disappearance, the tone shifted into something far more guarded. I cannot say this plainly even here, for fear these pages might one day be read by eyes I do not trust. I have seen something I should not have. A man of high standing, someone I had thought beyond reproach, behaving in a manner that suggests far greater corruption than I dared believe possible. I fear the emerald is not safe, and I fear more that should I speak of what I suspect, I shall not be believed. Or worse, I shall be made to disappear before I am given the chance to be heard at all. Rose's hands had begun to shake badly enough that Alistair took the journal gently from her, continuing to read aloud where she could not. The final surviving entry, dated only days before her disappearance, described a grand ball at which Isolde claimed to have witnessed, from a shadowed alcove, a distinguished nobleman exchanging 2 jewel cases with practiced, deliberate care. A switch performed so smoothly that anyone glancing in passing would have noticed nothing amiss. I do not know what was taken or what was put in its place, but I am certain now that whatever happens to the Emerald of Wessex, the blame will not fall where it ought. Rose pressed a hand to her temple, her face draining of color. A ball, she murmured. I remember. Candlelight, so many candles, and a man's hands, careful, quick, like a conjurer's trick. I was hidden, I think. I was not meant to see. She swayed where she stood, and Alistair caught her before she struck the floor, her eyes fluttering shut, the memory having surfaced at last with more force than her fragile, half-rebuilt mind could bear. Rose recovered within the hour, though the memory of the ball stayed with her afterward like a splinter beneath the skin, surfacing in fragments whenever her mind grew quiet. It was Lady Euphemia, once they had returned to Ravenscroft Hall and allowed Rose several days to rest, who suggested where they might look next. If she witnessed something at a ball, her ladyship said over breakfast, then it was likely held during the season, when such gatherings were common enough to draw half the kingdom's nobility under one roof. Isolde attended a great many that final year, but I recall she was especially taken with the assemblies at Bath. She wrote to me from there more than once. It was decided, after some careful planning, that Alistair and Rose would travel to Bath under discreet names, he as a Mr. Alistair Crane, a gentleman of modest fortune, and she simply as Miss Rose Hartley, a distant cousin accompanying him for her health. It was a thin disguise, but a necessary one, for word of the Duke's mysterious companion had begun to travel further than either of them liked, and neither wished to draw attention before they understood fully what they faced. Bath in late summer was a city of warm stone and crowded assembly rooms, of careful conversation over tea, and sharper conversation beneath the cover of music. They attended their first assembly on the second evening. Rose dressed plainly but well, her hair arranged to hide the faint scar above her brow, her composure held together by will alone. It was within the hour that she saw him. He stood near the card tables, a tall man of perhaps 50, silver threading through dark hair, his bearing the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never once in his life been questioned or denied. Alistair recognized him instantly, and felt his stomach turn to ice. "Marquis Cedric Blackthorne," he murmured to Rose, careful to keep his voice low. "He led the charges against you, against Isolde, 6 years ago. He stood before the royal court himself and called for her arrest." Rose had gone very still beside him, her eyes fixed on the Marquis with an intensity that had nothing to do with conscious recognition and everything to do with something deeper, something her body remembered even where her mind could not yet follow. "His voice," she whispered, when Blackthorne laughed at something said across the card table, a low, rich sound that carried easily over the music. "I know that voice." They did not approach him directly. Alistair judged it too dangerous, not yet certain what Blackthorne might do if confronted before they held proof enough to protect themselves. Instead, they remained at a careful distance throughout the evening, watching, while Rose grew steadily paler beside him. It came back to her in pieces over the following hour, each fragment arriving like a blow. A garden terrace, much like the one beyond the assembly room's tall windows. Blackthorne's voice, lower than his public manner, speaking urgently to another man she could not see clearly in memory, only the shape of him, his shoulders hunched in the manner of someone unused to dishonest dealings and uneasy in them. "The real stone for the false. No one shall know the difference, not until it is far too late to matter." And then, sharper, more frightening, the moment she realized she was not alone on that terrace, that she had been seen listening, and the cold, calculating look that crossed Blackthorne's face before he smiled and bid her good evening as though nothing at all had passed between them. "He knew," Rose said, gripping Alistair's arm tightly enough to bruise. "He knew I had hurt him. He smiled at me, and I thought nothing of it, because why would I imagine a man of his standing capable of such a thing? I was a fool." "You were trusting," Alistair corrected gently. "That is not the same as foolish." But the danger, he understood now, was very real and very immediate. For across the assembly room, Marquis Blackthorne had turned, quite by chance, and his gaze had settled upon Rose's face for a long, considering moment before sliding away again, his expression carefully blank. He said nothing to her that evening, made no move toward her at all, and yet, within the hour, Alistair noticed 2 unfamiliar men positioned near the assembly room's entrance who had not been there before, watching the crowd with the particular stillness of men paid to observe rather than enjoy themselves. By the time he and Rose quietly took their leave, he was certain of one thing above all else. Cedric Blackthorne had recognized the dead come walking, and a man with that much to lose would not simply allow the truth to surface on its own. They left Bath before dawn the following morning, certain that lingering even a single day longer would invite exactly the kind of attention they could not survive. Alistair arranged for a different carriage, hired under yet another false name, and for 2 days they kept to quiet roads and smaller inns, watching always for riders who lingered too long behind them. It was at the second of these inns, in a village not far from Glastonbury, that a message reached them, carried by a breathless young novice from the abbey, who had been sent, he said, on the instruction of an elderly monk attending a dying man. "He asked for the Duke of Ravenscroft by name," the novice explained, clearly bewildered by his own errand. "Brother Aldhelm would not say why, only that the matter could not wait, and that you would understand once you arrived." Alistair had told no one of his true name since leaving London, save the abbey itself in a discreet letter sent ahead requesting sanctuary should they need it. That the message had found them so precisely unsettled him, though Rose's hand on his arm steadied his nerves enough to agree they must go. The abbey rose grey and ancient against the hills, its stones older than the kingdom's current laws, its silence the kind that settled deep into the chest the moment one passed beneath its arch. Brother Aldhelm met them himself, a small, stooped man with kind eyes, and led them without ceremony to a narrow cell where a man lay dying upon a simple cot, his breath rattling, his skin the grey yellow of someone whose body had already begun preparing to leave it. "This is Mr. Josiah Penhallow," Brother Aldhelm said quietly. "He came to us a fortnight past, seeking confession. What he has told me, I believe, concerns you both directly. He has asked to repeat it before witnesses, that it might carry the weight of testimony rather than mere deathbed rambling. Penhallow's eyes opened at the sound of voices, fixing first on Alistair, then, with a sharp, indrawn breath, on Rose. "Lady Isolde," he whispered. "God forgive me, I thought you drowned. I have prayed every night these 6 years that you were dead, so that I might be spared the sight of your face and the shame it brings me." "Tell them," Brother Aldhelm urged gently. "Tell them what you told me." It came slowly, broken by coughing and long pauses for breath, but it came complete. Josiah Penhallow had been a royal jeweller, trusted with the care and occasional restoration of the crown's finest pieces, including the Emerald of Wessex. Some 7 years past, Marquis Cedric Blackthorne had approached him privately, holding over his head a debt of gambling so severe that ruin and debtor's prison awaited should it ever come to light. In exchange for its quiet settlement, Blackthorne demanded a single service: the creation of a flawless imitation of the emerald, indistinguishable from the true stone to any eye save the most expert. "I told myself it was harmless," Penhallow rasped. "A private vanity, perhaps. A man wishing a copy made for some reason of his own. I did not ask why. I did not wish to know." But the imitation, once complete, had not stayed in Blackthorne's private collection. It had been substituted for the genuine stone at the very ball where Isolde had witnessed the exchange, and when the theft was eventually discovered, staged, Penhallow now confessed, by Blackthorne himself to cast suspicion away from his own dealings, the blame had been laid swiftly and conveniently upon the one witness who might have exposed him. When Lady Isolde began asking questions of her own, Penhallow continued, his voice fading, Blackthorne came to me again, this time with fear in his face rather than confidence. He said she had to be silenced before she could speak to anyone of standing. I did not know what he intended. I swear before God I did not know he meant her harm, only that he meant to frighten her into silence. When I heard of the carriage, of her death upon the road, I understood what I had truly been party to, and I have not slept easily a single night since. He turned his head weakly toward Rose. The stone itself, the true emerald, Blackthorne never destroyed it. He could not bring himself to part with something so valuable, even as evidence of his own crime. It lies hidden within his family's mausoleum, in a compartment beneath the floor of the central vault. I helped him conceal it there myself, the week before your carriage was attacked. Brother Aldhelm had a scribe waiting, and the confession was written out in full, read back to Penhallow for his agreement, and signed with a shaking hand before 2 further monks as witnesses, and sealed with the abbey's own mark. He died within the hour, his breathing simply stopping between one moment and the next, his face strangely peaceful for a man who had carried such guilt so long. Alistair stood holding the sealed confession, the proof he had searched for across half of England finally resting in his hands, while beside him, Rose stared at nothing, her face pale and distant, caught somewhere between the relief of vindication and the cold horror of learning, in full and undeniable detail, exactly how close she had come to dying for the crime of simply seeing too much. They left Glastonbury with the confession secured in a locked dispatch box and turned their road toward Canterbury, where Alistair intended to consult an old friend from his university days, now a respected barrister, on how best to bring the matter before the royal court without giving Blackthorne time to flee or destroy what remained of the evidence against him. It was on the second day of that journey, as the carriage slowed to cross a narrow stone bridge over a swollen river, that Rose suddenly cried out for the driver to stop. Alistair caught her arm as she nearly threw herself from the carriage before it had fully halted, but she shook him off, not in fear, only urgency, and walked to the center of the bridge with the slow, unsteady steps of someone moving through a dream rather than waking life. She gripped the stone parapet and stared down at the water rushing beneath, brown and fast with recent rain, and Alistair saw the exact moment the last locked door in her memory swung open. "This is the bridge," she said, her voice strange and distant.
Not this one, the one near Escher, but it looked just like this. The same stone, the same sound of the water. I remember now, all of it.
She told it to him there on the bridge, in halting, broken sentences, as though saying it aloud might shatter her if she paused too long between words. The carriage attacked in driving rain, masked riders forcing the horses to bolt, the terrible lurch and crack as a wheel struck a boulder, and the whole carriage tipped sideways into the ravine. She remembered the cold shock of the river closing over her, the current dragging her under, her gown weighing her down like a stone. She remembered surfacing, gasping, carried far downstream before she managed to claw her way to the bank, half-conscious, bleeding from a wound at her temple she could not later recall receiving. After that, days blurred together, wandering half-starved through unfamiliar country lanes, too injured and disoriented to know her own name, let alone find her way home, until she collapsed at last on the road outside Escher, where the parish had found her.
I did not run from you,
she said, turning to face him at last, her eyes bright with unshed tears.
I want you to know that. I never meant to vanish from your life. I was simply lost, and then I was someone else entirely, and there was no road back to you that I could see.
I know, Alistair said, his own voice unsteady.
I never believed you guilty, Isolde, not for one single day.
But her face, rather than softening at the use of her true name, hardened with something he had not expected. A grief, sharper than relief, edged with anger she had not known she carried until this moment of full remembering.
You searched for me, she said slowly, and then you stopped. I remember now how desperately you searched in those first weeks. I can feel it, somehow, the shape of your grief, even from where I lay drowning. And then, eventually, you accepted I was dead. You wore mourning. You returned to Parliament. You let the world move on.
What else was I to do? He asked, pained. There was a body of evidence suggesting drowning, a ravine the magistrates searched thoroughly, weeks of silence with no word from you anywhere in the kingdom. I did not stop searching because I stopped loving you. I stopped because I believed I had lost the search already, and I could not bear to keep hoping against what every report told me was true.
I know,
she said quietly, and the anger in her seemed to drain away as quickly as it had risen, leaving only exhaustion behind it.
I do know that, Alistair. It is only 6 years. 6 years I spent kneading bread for strangers,
not knowing my own face in a looking-glass, while you mourned me properly and then, in time, continued living. I cannot resent you for surviving. I only grieve a little for the years neither of us can have returned to us. He crossed the bridge and took her hands in his, not pulling her close, only holding them, giving her the space to decide for herself how near she wished to stand.
Then let us not pretend the years did not happen, he said. Let us grieve them honestly, together, rather than each alone. I am not asking you to simply step back into the life you lost, Isolde. I am asking only to walk beside you while you decide what life you wish to build from what remains.
Isolde, for she was Isolde now, fully and completely, the last fragments of rose folded quietly into the woman she had always been, looked at him for a long moment beneath the grey Canterbury sky, the river rushing on below them exactly as it had on the night that nearly finished her, and finally, slowly, nodded. The retrieval of the emerald proved easier than Alistair had feared, though no less perilous. With Penhallow's sealed confession in hand describing the mausoleum's hidden compartment, Alistair engaged the discreet services of his barrister friend in Canterbury, who arranged for a magistrate's order permitting a search of the Blackthorne family vault on grounds of suspected concealment of stolen royal property. They moved quickly, before word could reach the Marquis himself, and found the true Emerald of Wessex exactly where the dying jeweller had described, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a false floor panel, its deep green fire undimmed by 6 years of darkness. With the stone recovered, the confession secured, and Lady Euphemia summoned from Northumberland to testify to Isolde's identity alongside parish records from Esher and the surviving servants of Ravenscroft Hall who remembered her clearly, Alistair petitioned for an audience before the royal court at Windsor.
The court convened on a grey autumn morning, the great hall filled with nobility, drawn by curiosity and, in no small number, by dread. Word had spread in the days prior that the Duke of Ravenscroft intended to reopen the long-settled scandal of the Emerald of Wessex, and several among the assembled lords shifted uneasily in their seats, aware that corruption reaching as high as Blackthorn rarely confined itself to a single guilty man. Blackthorn himself arrived composed, immaculately dressed, his expression one of wounded confusion rather than fear, as though the entire proceeding were a tedious misunderstanding he intended to clear up before luncheon. "Your Majesty's court will forgive me," he said smoothly, when given leave to speak, "but I confess astonishment. The Duke asks us to believe a common woman found wandering a country road is, in fact, Lady Isolde Fairhaven, dead these 6 years. I have met a great many ambitious women in my time, eager for a title and fortune not rightfully theirs. I fear His Grace, in his loneliness, has been cruelly deceived by an impostor." A murmur ran through the hall, and for a moment Alistair feared the court's sympathy might tip dangerously toward doubt. But Isolde, standing beside him in a gown of deep blue silk that restored to her every inch of the dignity poverty had stripped away, did not flinch. "Then let the court judge for itself," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "Lady Euphemia Ravenscroft has known me since childhood. Reverend Thorne of St. Aldwyn's parish can attest to the scar I carry from a fall at the age of 9. The very scar my old nurse, were she still living, would recognize instantly. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, can confirm the journal removed from his keeping by a man matching the Marquess's own description. And Mr. Josiah Penhallow, before God took him, signed and sealed a confession naming Lord Blackthorn directly in the theft of the emerald and the attack upon my carriage." The dispatch box was opened. The confession was read aloud in full by the court's clerk, every damning sentence landing into a silence so complete that Blackthorn's composure finally began to crack, visible at the edges. "A dying man's ravings," he protested, his voice rising for the first time. "Penhallow was known to drink heavily in his final years. Who can say what fevered nonsense he—" "The emerald itself," Alistair interrupted, stepping forward, "was recovered precisely where the confession indicated, within your own family's mausoleum, my lord. Perhaps you might explain to this court how the genuine crown jewel came to rest beneath your floor, if you had no part whatsoever in its disappearance." The stone was produced and presented before the throne, its authenticity confirmed within minutes by the crown's own jeweler, called forward specifically to examine it. The false stone, still displayed for 6 years in the royal vault as the genuine article, was brought beside it for comparison, and even the least discerning eye in the hall could see, set side by side, the subtle differences between true gem and clever imitation. Blackthorn's protests grew increasingly desperate, then increasingly silent, as one piece of testimony after another was laid before the court. Lady Euphemia's tearful, unwavering identification, the parish records confirming the timeline of Isolde's discovery, even a former footman of Blackthorn's own household who, sensing the tide had turned irreversibly, came forward to confirm having once overheard his master discussing the Esher Road and a carriage that needed to meet with an accident. By the time the court's verdict was delivered, Blackthorn stood alone, his allies among the nobility having quietly distanced themselves the moment his guilt became undeniable. His titles were stripped before the assembled court, his estates seized pending further investigation into the gambling debts and corruption that had first set the entire tragedy into motion, and he was led from Windsor under guard, his protests finally and completely silenced. Before the throne itself, Isolde Fairhaven's name was formally cleared, her innocence proclaimed not merely restored, but declared to have never truly been in question, save for the lies of a desperate, guilty man. Lady Euphemia wept openly. Even several lords who had whispered cruelly of Isolde's supposed theft 6 years past now bowed their heads to her in apology, and Isolde,
standing tall in the great hall where her ruin had once been decided, accepted their contrition with a grace that owed nothing to the years of poverty that had nearly broken her, and everything to the woman she had always been underneath. In the weeks following the trial, Alistair did the one thing 6 years of grief and longing had not prepared him for. He waited. He understood, watching Isolde move through the rebuilt rooms of her restored reputation, that the woman who had emerged from that ravine was not simply the bride he had lost, returned whole and unchanged. She had survived 6 years he could not share in, had built a kind of quiet strength out of poverty and forgetting that no sheltered life at Ravenscroft Hall could have given her. To ask her again to be his wife so soon and so easily felt to him like asking her to fold all of that suffering away as though it had never mattered. So he did not ask. He offered instead, simply, his company. He accompanied her when she wished to visit Reverend Thorne and the parish that had sheltered her, watched her press a generous sum into the church's charitable fund with tears in her eyes for the kindness shown to a girl with no name. He sat with her in the long evenings at Ravenscroft Hall while she relearned, slowly, the pianoforte her fingers still half remembered, and said nothing when her playing faltered into silence and she simply sat, with her hands resting on the keys, overwhelmed by a memory too large for the moment. "You are not pressing me," she observed one evening, some months after the trial, as they walked together along the gallery lined with portraits of Ravenscroft ancestors who had, in their time, weathered their own scandals and survived them. "I have learned the cost of certainty," he said. "I was certain you were dead. I was wrong. I shall not make the mistake again of believing I know better than you what you are ready for." It was Isolde herself, in the end, who suggested the journey to the Lake District in early spring, when the worst of the cold had broken and the fells were softening into green beneath the last patches of snow. She said only that she wished to see somewhere entirely new, somewhere that held no memory at all, good or terrible, where she might simply exist for a while as herself and no one else's lost or found lady. They traveled without urgency, stopping in small villages along the way, visiting country churches with worn stone floors and quiet, unremarkable graveyards, walking the shores of lakes so still they mirrored the sky perfectly. Isolde laughed more freely there than Alistair had heard her laugh since their reunion began, unburdened for those weeks by court and title and the long shadow of what had nearly destroyed her. It was beside one such lake, near a small chapel with ivy climbing its walls and apple blossoms scattering pink across the churchyard path, that Alistair finally found the courage to speak what he had carried silently for months. "I am not asking you this because of a promise made 6 years ago beneath a cedar tree," he said, taking her hand as they stood looking out over the still water. "That promise belonged to two people who no longer entirely exist, not as we were then. I am asking you now, as the woman who survived a river and a stolen name and built herself anew out of flower dust and perished charity, whether you would choose me again, knowing everything it has cost us both to arrive at this lake, on this particular spring morning." Isolde turned to him, the blossom drifting down around them, and for a long moment said nothing at all, only studied his face as though searching for something she needed to be certain of before answering. "I have thought, more than once these past months," she said finally, "that I owed you nothing simply because of who I once was to you. A promise made by a girl I can barely recognize now does not bind the woman I have become. But I find, when I look at you, that I do not wish to refuse out of pride or fear or some misguided notion that suffering ought to have changed me beyond all recognition of what I want. I want this, not because I must, because I choose it, freely, with everything I now know about loss and survival and the particular kindness of a man who waited rather than demanded." He did not kneel, as he once had beneath the cedar tree. He simply drew her close, there beside the quiet lake, and kissed her as the apple blossom fell around them both, and felt, for the first time in 6 long years, that the grief he had carried so privately for so long had finally found somewhere to set itself down.
Their wedding, when it came that summer, was a small affair by the standards of their station, held in the same ivy-covered chapel beside the lake, attended only by those who had remained loyal through every hardship. Lady Euphemia, weeping happily through the entire ceremony, Reverend Thorne, who had travelled north specially for the occasion, the parish bakers who had once given Isolde nothing more than bread and shelter and now found themselves guests at a duke's wedding. There was no grand spectacle, no royal attendance, no display of the recovered emerald, which Isolde had insisted be returned quietly to the crown's keeping without further fanfare. There was only the two of them, standing where the world had finally stopped trying to keep them apart, choosing each other again, not out of obligation to a promise made in another lifetime, but freely, fully, with 6 years of loss behind them and, at last, an unburdened future stretching out ahead.